It wasn't that he zeroed in on the Pharisees. Sometimes he would do that, but not always. And it wasn't that he would do miracles. He'd do that sometimes, but not always. There was one thing that he always did. Jesus always told a parable. In Matthew 13:34, it says, he said nothing to them without a parable. Every time he had the opportunity, he would always use a parable. So obviously they're very important to him. And I think it's crucial that we understand the parables, it's so amazing how much, at least for me, I bet so for you, the parables that we're very familiar with, and we'll spend a little bit more time on it, and a teacher will talk about it, and you'll see things you never noticed before. They seem endless as far as lessons that we can derive from parables. It's important to understand each of them, but it's also important to understand why he told them. And I think sometimes the catchphrases that we come up with are very helpful, and I'm not saying that this is a bad thing, but sometimes they can oversimplify things. Sometimes we have our definitions to kind of help capture certain things, and we have one for parables, and I think it's accurate. Sometimes we'll say, well, what's a parable? It's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, and sometimes that's good for the conversation at the time. That is helpful, but it can also be misleading. A lot of our catchphrases are like that, maybe. Many think that a parable is designed just to make the truth easier, that it's a heavenly meaning, and so he used something simple to just kind of hold their hand and walk them towards that more complicated meaning. And everybody loves a good story. Sometimes we'll dismiss parables as that it was just simply a way for him to say, okay, let me help you through this or that. Let me tell you a good story just as an attention getter kind of thing. And that kind of, I guess, reduces parables to something that's just to keep people interested. And there's so much more going on than that. It's far from the truth. God clearly wants everyone to be saved. But you'll notice that Jesus was never distracted by the popular vote. I'm going to show you some other things in John 6 if you're not already there. For the sake of time, I'll just refer to a couple of things. God obviously wants everybody to be saved. But you'll notice that when Jesus would teach things, he was not too distracted by how popular what he had to say, how well it was received. There was a lesson in particular that was not well received. He had a bunch of followers at this point, but the numbers went way down as a direct result of what he said. It's described sometimes as a huge crowd. It's about 5,000 plus, and they're all fans of his. This is a population of a small town. We're probably talking several beyond 5,000, and there's this massive walkout after he presents a lesson in John 6:48. The lesson is essentially about the bread of life, and it's not a difficult concept. He's basically saying under the old covenant, when they were wandering through the wilderness and they depended on their sustenance for that manna that came from heaven, he says, I'm that now. Under the new covenant, I'm kind of like your manna from heaven. I'm the bread that will keep you alive during this stretch of the promise. Well, it didn't go well. Strangely enough, John 6:52, you can read it for yourself. The audience is kind of looking at each other because he's talking about, I'm the bread of life. You have to eat my flesh, drink my blood. And they sloppily conclude that he's talking about cannibalism. That's what they do. They say, okay, what are we supposed to do? Eat your flesh and drink your blood? John 6, verse 60, Scott just read for us. Their conclusion is, this is a hard teaching. Who can accept it? And I think they use this misinterpretation to kind of walk away. Look at verse 66. Here it is, John 6 and verse 66, this walkout. Remember, he has thousands that are big fans of his, but watch this. As a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. That was it. So I think it's important to notice this verse in particular and notice what doesn't follow, what Jesus doesn't do next, what he does not do. He did not chase after them. He did not try to catch up with them and say, wait, let me reword this. Maybe we're not on the same page here. He didn't cushion the blow at all. He let them walk away. His lesson had not been a failure. It actually had accomplished something pretty important. It revealed the nature of the majority. You probably are well aware that they were all about making him an earthly king, and the fact that he could provide bread out of just a handful of bread was a big draw for them. But he knew their agenda was in conflict with his, and instead of smoothing things over and trying to remove that difference by kind of softening things up, he drew attention to it. He'd given them physical bread, and he knew it was time to talk about the spiritual bread, and that upgrade offended their world brains. You might think of it that way. They called it a hard teaching, and that's because they had world thinking going on. So wait a second, we're not following here. Are you talking about cannibalism? And you almost want to shake your head at him and say, of course not. And it's just that they didn't want to go where he was thinking, apparently. So about 5,000 followers stopped following. A few remained, about 12. It says 12. The 12 stayed back. Even then, you'll notice, look at verse 67. You'd think that Jesus would say, boy, I sure am glad you guys didn't go. That was quite a walkout, wasn't it? Even now, Jesus doesn't lighten up, and he gives them an out. Notice what he says in verse 67. So Jesus said to the 12, you do not want to go away also, do you? It's almost like he's saying, hey, there's the same door they used. Do you want to leave? And Peter, basically his response is absolutely not. No, where else would we go? And then Jesus captured the heart of what had just happened, what was going on that seemed to go awry. Here's John 6, verse 68. Set your mind on things above, not on the things that are on the earth. These 12 that stayed behind, they were really trying. They're trying to say, okay, we've got to change our way of thinking. The 5,000 that just left, those 5,000 plus, they were not. They were locked into a certain way of thinking. And this was the deciding factor of truth. It was the condition of the listeners. It wasn't his message. So I tell you all that to maybe help explain something that happened at a different time. And this is Matthew 13. And this is where I'm headed. We'll read a little bit of Matthew 13. Matthew 13, you might file that away. It's a good chapter to remember because there's a bunch of parables presented here. But Matthew 13 also directly explains why he told the parables. And I think it would come as a shock to most people who have just thought of parables as nice stories. So here's Matthew 13, verse 1. We got another big crowd. That day Jesus went out of the house and was sitting by the sea, and large crowds gathered to him. So he got into a boat and sat down, and the whole crowd was standing on the beach. There's so many people on the shore, he has to get into a boat, kind of a impromptu podium, and back away in the water so he can address everybody. Some scholars say this was the greatest audience he had ever addressed. It's a lot of people. And this is when he presents the parable about the soils, very famous. We all know about it, the 4 different kinds. And he presents it in 2 parts. It's a 2-part message. Part 1 is the parable itself. That's in Matthew 13 in the first 9 verses. Part 2 is the explanation for the parable. That's in verses 18 through 23. It's very important to notice something about that day. Not everyone stayed for both parts. The large crowds heard part 1 and then left. In this case, it wasn't because they were offended. They just didn't bother to stick around, apparently. Only the disciples heard part 2. Look at verse 10 there, Matthew 13:10. I think that's pretty significant. Here's the parable. Everybody leaves, and then there's the explanation. One of the key differences between those really looking for the truth and those window shopping is that the disciples stuck around. They even asked him about the parables. This is where we get the answers. Here's Matthew 13:10. Why do you speak to them in parables? And he doesn't say, and again, I'm not knocking this phrase, but he doesn't say, well, it's just an earthly message with a heavenly meaning. He doesn't say that. He makes a point by quoting Isaiah, and here it is. Listen carefully to what he says. Here's why I tell parables. Verse 13. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because while seeing, they do not see. And while hearing, they do not hear, nor do they understand. In their case, the prophecy of Isaiah is being fulfilled, which says, you will keep on seeing, but will not understand. You will keep on seeing, but will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull. With their ears they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise they would see with their eyes, hear with their ears, and understand with their heart and return, and I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. The parables weren't just catchy stories. Jesus used them as a filter. It was an effective way to sift out those who are really searching. To the shallow followers, just skimming the situation, it all ended with a shrug or being confused or even offended. I was trying to think of a couple of examples. One of them happened to me. I was taking a college class, and I wasn't not social enough or unshy enough to meet with a counselor, so I just said, well, I probably can figure this out, and I took a class. And I think I mentioned this to some of you before, and I sat in the class, and about halfway through the semester realized there was something called a prerequisite, which meant all the classes I should have taken before I got to this part. I had not taken part one. I was just in part two. I called that the semester of the shrug. I had no idea what was going on. I squeaked by. It was not fun. I spent most of the time just kind of looking around and pretending I knew what was going on, and it was not an enjoyable experience at all. I'll pick on my niece. She came to mind too, and she's not here, so we can talk about her. Gossip doesn't count on Sunday, right? So I think she was 13 or 14, and she kept hearing about this movie called Gone with the Wind. So I'm going to watch Gone with the Wind. And she watched it, and later, she watched it on her own, a couple of DVDs, and she got done. We said, what'd you think? She said, I don't know why everybody likes it. I was really confused. We kept asking her questions and trying to figure out what was going on. Finally got down to the bottom of it. She didn't know there were 2 discs. She had started with part 2. So the movie starts with Atlanta burning. And so she was kind of confused. Again, lots of confusion, not knowing what's going on. It was not an enjoyable experience because she was missing a key part of everything. The parables are kind of like that. They do something that God emphasized throughout the Old Testament. It makes distinctions. I'm sure you noticed through your daily Bible reading, God, right from the very beginning, He's like, this is day, this is night. This is clean, this is unclean. This is holy, this is profane. This is a follower, this is a fan. God has always provided distinctions and then let us choose where to stand. He shows us where the line is, and we get to decide which side we're on. Now, when someone's baptized, they are absolutely saved. That's really important to lock that into our minds. It's vital that we enjoy the peace of mind that comes from that, but it's also vital to maintain an accurate perception of things. We can lose that. We can slip back into world thinking. I mean, just think about it. We spent some time this morning talking about trying to clear our heads of the world, and then we spend the rest of the day and the rest of the week involved in world stuff. It's hard to maintain that perception. It's possible to be in the crowd of followers and not truly a disciple. A true disciple sticks around and makes the effort to get past the surface. So Jesus in his parables tell us something else that's pretty relevant today. As far as numbers go, the parables were devastating. Can you imagine a modern congregation of maybe 5,000 or plus, and some guy got up and delivered a lesson, and they lost 5,000 members? If a lesson or a Bible class caused that kind of walkout, there'd be a panic. Today, if there's a large enough group that's offended, the standard response is, well, let's regroup. Let's revisit the scriptures, make things more user-friendly. It becomes a matter of chasing after the disgruntled and pleading for them to come back. That's not how Jesus did it. One of the primary things about the truth is it's designed to sift. And don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about being offensive or volatile just to get people riled up and get, as an attention getter. That's just marketing tactics. I'm talking about the will of God as presented in Scripture. Jesus was never offensive for the sake of being offensive. Everything he said or did was driven by love, but he never lightened up on the truth for the sake of numbers. Paul was inspired by God, who made a very important statement about reaching the lost. And this, I think, helps strike the balance. You probably remember this. Paul said, you know what? I became this, I became that. And then in 1 Corinthians 9:23, he says, I've become all things to all men. I do what I can to be flexible, to reach people. And that's a great example for us, to be ready to adapt to the situation. He was so good at that. And to humble ourselves, to be flexible, to reach those who are lost. And he says, I'll do whatever I can. We should all do that. We should be all things to all men. But that's not what the Word of God does. It is what it is. One of the things it is a revealer of our nature, a sifter of souls. So all of this is, I'm thinking about this because I think the parables are fascinating. We kind of often dismiss them as just nice stories, but it was a test. Who's going to stick around? Who's really looking? And all this makes me realize that it's very possible to be baptized and end up just sitting on the surface of things. We were talking in class this morning. Remind me of a verse in Jeremiah 29:13. You will seek me and find me when you search for me with all your heart. And that search does not end at baptism. So I'll just leave you with this. Part 1 has been challenging. Some of part 1 has been hard. It's hard to understand. It's hard to take. When you're baptized, you're then confronted. It's time to make some changes. You can't just mosey on along as you are. That's why a lot of people look for something that resembles Christianity so that they don't have to change. So part 1 is challenging. And part 1 can be hard. But I don't know about you. I'm going to make sure I don't miss out on part 2. I think there's a lot of Christianity that I'm missing out on because I don't stick around. I don't really dig and make sure that I'm more than just a fan, that I'm a true follower. And I'm gonna do better at sticking around for part 2. Because from what I understand, part 3 is even better. It's going to be amazing. So I hope this is an encouragement to you as we stand together and sing.
Sorrow and night, Jesus I come, Jesus I come, into thy freedom, gladness and light. Jesus I come to thee, out of my sickness into thy health, out of my want and into thy wealth, out of my sin and into thyself. Jesus, I come to thee, out of my shameful failure and loss. Jesus, I come. Jesus, I come into the glorious gain of thy cross. Jesus, I come to thee, out of earth's sorrows into thy balm, out of life's storms and into thy calm, out of distress to jubilant psalm. Jesus,